Crane checked his boots, again. 3 weeks they'd been on this planet and at least half of the expeditionary force was sick. 13 were dead. The rest had become paranoid. Getting anyone to step outside the prefabricated base was becoming somewhat difficult. When they'd first discovered this world, it looked peaceful. Deep blue oceans, varied landscapes and biomass across the continents, blue skies. That last was a bit disconcerting. The particular mix of atmospheric gases meant everyone would feel a bit giddy for the first 24 hours or so. Higher oxygen levels often had that effect on ponies. But the planet was otherwise ideal. The humans thought so too. So the race was on to establish a self-sufficient base. The humans had started something nearby only 7 days ago. Initial surface scans had shown a great variety of vegetation, oceans and rivers teeming with water life, and a myriad of ground-based and aerial life forms, all seeming somewhat harmonious in nature. There were some rather unusual bacterial strains in the soil samples gathered by the first couple of drones, but that wasn't particularly disturbing. In short, everything looked great for setting up a colony. Crane shook his feathers. He checked his boots again. Sure enough, there it was. Another multi-legged creature had made its way into the toe of the boot, its tiny fangs glistening in the light from his torch. He grabbed it with the sampling probes. It wriggled, shook itself almost maniacally, trying to reach his hand and inject its extremely painful toxin. Crane opened his sample container and dropped the beast in. Only a few cms long and relatively docile until you grabbed it or squashed it with a foot. Its brightly colored chitinous body had earned it the nickname, Jewel Bug. When they'd first appeared around the base, about 4 days after they'd arrived, what they'd originally thought of as a pleasant little creature had become a menace. Within a week of their arrival, 7 people had died excruciating deaths from the venom of the males. They'd come searching for the females that had been caught and placed in display cases. Pretty little things, but their confinement had caused them to release a pheromone. A pheromone that seemed to have been absorbed into every nook and cranny of the base. Now the males were everywhere. But at least if you checked your boots before you put them on, stayed away from darkened rooms, and didn't put your hands anywhere before checking, they could be dealt with. At least, they weren't trying to kill you. Crane slid his foot carefully into his boot, then checked his exosuit's helmet. All clear. He pondered the greasy dark streak across the back of it and shrugged. Finally, he could get outside and away from his brood mates. He hated this planet. He jammed the suit helmet down on his head, a tight fit with his feathers, but once sealed, the air conditioning would keep the temperature comfortable, even if his head and back feathers would be crushed by the time he got back. Someone had to gather the supplies from the latest dropship. He stepped into the airlock, something they never thought they'd need, checked all around him for any more of the critters, then shut the internal door. A gentle hiss as the outer door opened, and he cautiously looked outside, checking first left, then right, then scanning the trees ahead. Everything appeared to be clear. He checked his sidearm, fully loaded, brought up the navigation display on his helmet, and set out. It'd take him about an hour to get to the drop pod, then half an hour to drive the new delivered buggy back. Once they had the self-contained buggy, they'd be able to drive directly from the docking section of the base and maybe get some farming happening, or perhaps even start mining for essential resources. Crane had his weapon in his hand as he stepped out. He hadn't gone 10 steps when something moved in the short grass. A legless reptile struck at his left boot, grasping his heel in its fanged mouth as it looped itself around his leg. The laser sliced a head from the body, which twitched uncontrollably as the severed head continued to try to chew through the boot, not yet realizing it was dead. Today was not going to be a good day, at least, until he reached the drop site. He kicked the head of the creature off and heard a chuckle over the comms. "You want to get this pod mixed?" "Sorry, Crane. I didn't see that one. Should be clear for at least the next 10 minutes, then you're on your own." "Yeah, I know," Crane replied. "Any news from the humans?" "Not since they landed. You're the only one they've talked to. They're probably all dead." Crane humphed in response. If I'm not back in 2 hours. Yeah, I know, I'll look after your mate. Mix chuckled. Crane ignored Mixed. He stretched for a moment, then looked around for any more creatures and started walking. They'd managed to build a track to the drop site. The location of the base was ideal. But the mineral vein that made it so caused the drop pods to lose navigation control in the lower atmosphere. Several had crashed into the steep rock faces, destroying the equipment. The decision to move the drop site had been made by someone off-planet, and now they were stuck with it. He trudged along the trail, scanning left and right, looking for anything else that might be a problem. The trail was already becoming overgrown. Life on this planet didn't like to be disturbed. The edges, which a few days ago had been bare earth, were already shooting with the ubiquitous green-blue fronds of low fern-like plants. Creatures seemed to prefer defecating on the track's smooth surface, but thankfully few, if any, stayed on the path for long. Unfortunately, that was because it offered no cover from predatory aerial creatures. There was one particularly aggressive black and white-beaked reptile. It was the reason he wore the full helmet. On the third day after arrival, one of the construction crews had felled a tree. Unfortunately, the reptile had nested in it. Swooping down from a nearby roost, the creature attacked the face of one of the workers, neatly removing 2 of his eyes and consuming them. Then it regurgitated them in chunks. With one eye left, he and the rest of the team retreated into the base, but not before one of the others had his mane feathers ripped from the back of his head. Sure enough, it was back, diving toward him, as it did everyone who ventured outside the base. He shot at it, but the crafty creature dove and dodged sideways, acrobatically avoiding the shots, never staying still long enough for Crane to get a telling shot. Several minutes later, and with a lucky shot having singed one wingtip, the creature retreated. Crane smirked. Served it right. He jogged on for a while to be sure he'd left the creature's range. Slowing down as he approached a gentle downward incline. Here he had to watch out for another reptile. He checked the ridge near the track, and everything appeared to be clear. Appeared to be. He mumbled to himself in frustration at the journey so far and started down the hill. As he approached the halfway point, he thought something had finally gone right and let out a sigh of relief. He started jogging, relaxing into the rhythm of running downhill, smiling to himself. Then he heard it. He looked over his shoulder, the humming sound behind him rapidly approaching. Just in time, he dove to the left. The coiled loop of living reptile rolled past faster than he could run, the hum generated by the ridged scales on its back as they tore through the air. It veered toward where he lay, but couldn't adjust its trajectory quickly enough. These creatures, several meters long, would wait in a tree on hillsides, usually near the top. When suitable prey passed by, they'd launch themselves from the tree and form a ring with their bodies, allowing them to gather speed as they rolled downhill. When they were close enough, they'd launch again and hit their target with a head of near solid bone, wrap themselves around a convenient neck or limb, sink their short fangs in, and wait for their prey's insides to start dissolving before quietly drinking its body. One of these things could desiccate opponents over 2 to 3 days, leaving only a skin bag filled with brittle bones. That was how the previous volunteer had died. But this one had missed. Crane had been lucky. The creatures had let out a screech as it passed, frustrated at missing its prey. His exosuit would have protected him from the venom, but these things were strong and hard to remove once coiled around you. And getting hit by one in full flight hurt a lot. He picked himself up, dusted himself off, and watched for any sign of the reptile. All clear. They were much slower moving when not rolling down hills or leaping at you, so he figured he was as safe as he could be on this forsaken planet. He thought ahead to the drop site, wondering if any of the humans would be nearby. As he resumed his journey, the area around the track opened up. There were fewer trees now, almost a grassy plain, until he neared the drop site, then it would be a short trip through a dense thicket to the clearing. He quickened his pace, and for a time, was undisturbed. Not many creatures prowled the plain. Finally, he was making good time, his steady stride eating up the distance he had remaining. He thought about what he'd been told would be in the supply drop. An enclosed vehicle, which would make this trip far less hazardous. Plasti steel frames would offer crash protection, but without the ferro glass canopy, any of the wildlife on this planet could easily attack anyone. That's why the last buggy had crashed. The driver had been attacked, panicked, and driven into a ravine. Then just as they were trying to get out of the wrecked vehicle, the flash flood hit, caused by a rainstorm miles away. One of the crew had died. The others were still in medical. Oh, great. Just thinking about it, and it started. Small droplets of water soon became a torrential downpour. Without his suit, he would have been drenched. As it was, the track was becoming slippery, as mud from the sides of the road washed across its surface. He slowed his pace, but was still making reasonable time, as long as he was careful. He slipped, and a gray blur flashed past his visor. He rolled away just in time, as two large clawed feet landed inches from where his head had been. Staring into an elongated jaw filled with yellowed blades, a double row of canonoid teeth snapped at him. He drew his sidearm and fired. The creature shook itself and backed off a couple of feet, snarling. The hair on its back lifting, ready to pounce. He fired again, shearing off half its skull as it lunged, then collapsed on top of him, dead. Well, that was that. Something had gone right. Sort of. He rolled the heavy beast off him and checked his suit as he stood. No tears, all good. Still dry, but he'd have some bruises in the morning. Just a few more to add to the mix. Back on his feet and alert for more of the plains hunters, he trudged toward the tree line. This could be the most dangerous part of the journey. A fur-bound tree-dwelling horror lived in this part of the forest. He looked up, trying to spot the bright red fur that marked the top and backs of their heads. As long as they weren't directly above him, he'd be relatively safe. Although excellent climbers and incredibly strong, the creatures were clumsy and ungainly on the ground. Should one land on you, they'd immediately wrench limbs and try to bite the back of the neck. Failing that, they'd rip out your throat. In a last-ditch effort to feed, they'd wrap their short arms around the head, biting down and raking with their back claws, trying to disembowel their prey. Though relatively compact, the creature was all densely muscled. One of them had torn the helmet off an exosuit with the wearer's head still inside. That was the third death so far. Watching the trees, just as he neared the drop pod, he tripped, sprawled on his face, and cracked his visor. Then he heard the chuckle. He lifted his head and looked at the human. The creature seemed oblivious to everything around him. Sitting in a rain-soaked short-sleeved shirt, a short pair of leg coverings, some kind of flimsy primitive footwear, and a broad-brimmed head covering. The human had a burning white cylinder hanging from one corner of his mushy-looking pink mouth as stained teeth grinned at him. "Oh no. Not you. Would they send you?" Crane mumbled to himself. "Day mate. Glad you made it. Saw the pod come down. You checked your boots right. No red backs." Crane grunted and nodded as he stood and made his way towards the already stacked crates. "Step on a brownie," the human said, looking at Crane's left leg. Crane grunted again, trying to focus on his task. The atonal mutterings of humans were annoying. Magpies. Hoop snakes. Crane was getting a little frustrated as the being narrated his journey. "Made it past the ruse, I see. And, did you see any drop bears?" "Not this time, did what you said, it worked." Crane pointed to the streak of black terry substance across the back of his neck. "Told you mate, Vegemite on the back of the neck. Only thing that'll keep him away." Crane stood slowly to his full height of nearly 2 meters, much taller than the human before him. "Where's the buggy?" he asked. "Listen mate, the Ute's over there. She's okay. I checked her out for you. Drives like a beauty. I may have scratched the paint a little. Nice sized tray in the back and room for 2 in the cab." "Huh?" "The UT utility vehicle," the human said, as if trying to spell it out. "By the way, I read your messages, comms boxes in the Ute. They're pulling you out. Too dangerous they reckon." Crane looked at the human in shock. Then the being's words registered and he smiled. Almost laughed. Joy surged through his body. About time. Crane paused for a moment, considering. The humans had arrived only a week ago. Wondering, he asked, "You leaving too?" "Nah mate, the beers are free," the human said. He chugged down another drink from the bottle sitting next to him. One of the perks of starting things off. Crane looked at the human in shock. "But what isn't trying to kill you is trying to eat you alive. And if it's not the creatures, the floods and forest fires." "Bushfires, mate. There ain't no real forests here. Besides, this place is just like home, only peaceful." The human grinned again. "She'll be right." Crane shook his head. "Frickin' Aussies." Author's name and the link to original text is in the description. Consider tapping the thumbs up and pressing the subscribe button if you enjoyed this video.